They said the beast ate men whole and left their boots at the tree line as a warning. They said his eyes burned gold in the dark, that whatever he had once been, lord, warrior, king, had been devoured by something that could never be reasoned with or saved. What no one knew was that he had been watching her for weeks, that he had let her come closer every night. She thought she was here to feed a monster no one else would pity. She had no idea she was about to fall in love with a king. The moon bled silver through the canopy of the forbidden forest, turning every twisted branch into a claw reaching for Clara's throat. She pressed on anyway, boots silent on the moss, the satchel heavy against her hip like a guilty secret. One snap of a twig and the patrol torches would appear at the tree line. They'd call it treason. But the howls that had kept her awake for months weren't roars of hunger. They were lonely. The same sound her own chest made every night when she remembered her sister's empty bed. Clara crouched behind the oak tree she'd claimed as her landmark weeks ago, heart racing. She unwrapped the meat from her satchel with careful hands, still warm from the smokehouse she'd risked sneaking into at dusk. Village rations were thin this spring. She'd gone without dinner herself to bring this. Foolish, reckless, but necessary. She'd first heard the howls the night her sister Mara vanished into these same trees. Everyone said the beast had taken her, but Clara had seen the tracks, too large for wolf, too deliberate for madness, and the howls that followed had sounded like grief, not triumph. Grief, she understood. So she came. Every night. She left meat, whispered comforts into the wind, and slipped away before the creature could decide she was prey. Tonight the forest felt different, too still, as if it were holding its breath with her. She set the meat on the stone she'd dragged into place weeks ago, then immediately retreated 3 long paces, palms raised in the universal gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," she murmured, voice low and steady. A low growl rolled through the underbrush, closer than it had ever been. Not angry, curious. Clara's pulse spiked, but she didn't run. The shadows between the trees shifted. Something enormous moved with the liquid grace of a predator who knew every root and rock by name. Golden eyes caught the moonlight first, bright, ancient, and far too intelligent. Then the rest of him. Thick black fur shot through with silver, shoulders broader than any stallion's, paws the size of dinner platters. Scars laced his muzzle like old lightning. A broken chain of black iron still dangled from one massive foreleg, clinking softly. He stopped 10 paces away, nostrils flaring at the scent of the offering. His eyes locked on hers and held. Clara's breath caught, not from fear, but from the sudden, impossible certainty that he recognized her, that he'd been waiting. She should have been terrified. Instead, a strange warmth unfurled low in her belly. She shoved it down hard. This was a beast, a killer. And yet, he took one slow step forward, then another, muscles rolling beneath his pelt. The chain dragged behind him, leaving a thin trench in the moss. When he reached the stone, he lowered his great head, but he didn't eat. He simply stared at her, ears flicking once, as if asking a question she couldn't possibly answer. Clara's voice came out rough. "You're not what they say you are you?" The beast's lips peeled back, just enough to show the glint of fangs, but the sound that left him wasn't a snarl. It was almost a sigh. When the beast finally lowered his muzzle to the meat, he didn't tear into it like a wild animal. Instead, he ate with oddly careful manners, one strip at a time, mindful not to scatter crumbs across the moss. His massive shoulders relaxed, ears flicking forward. A soft huff of breath escaped him after the 3rd piece, almost like satisfaction. Something inside Clara's chest cracked open like the first thaw of spring. For the first time since Mara disappeared, the hollow place didn't feel quite so empty. She stayed longer than she should have, unable to look away. When he finished, he didn't vanish back into the dark. He sat, massive and strangely regal, and simply looked at her, golden eyes steady, patient, almost gentle. Clara swallowed. "I'll come back," she whispered, "if you want me to." The beast dipped his head once, the motion so human it stole the air from her lungs. Then the wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of horses and steel and men who smelled of smoke and malice. The beast's ears snapped forward. A warning growl built in his chest. Clara's blood turned to ice. Were they coming for him? Or her? The beast surged to his feet with terrifying speed, massive head swinging toward the sound. A low, urgent rumble vibrated through him, sharp, commanding. He took one step toward her, then another, golden eyes locking on hers with fierce intensity. The message was unmistakable. Go. Now. Clara hesitated only a heartbeat. Then she turned and ran. Her boots pounded over moss and twisted roots, cloak whipping behind her. Branches snagged at her hair and sleeves, leaving thin scratches that burned like accusations. Behind her, the forest erupted with noise. Shouts of men, the clash of metal, the thunder of hooves. The hunters had not expected to find her in the depths of the forbidden forest. Their voices rose in sharp excitement. "A woman. She's been feeding the abomination. Grimward paid double for treason like this. Bring her down alive if you can." Panic clawed up Clara's throat. She knew those voices. Thomas, the blacksmith's son. Gavin, one of the village wardens. Men she had healed fevers for. Men whose children she had delivered tonics to when winter coughs took hold. Now they hunted her with the same righteous fury they reserved for the beast. She veered left, lungs burning, trying to lose them among the blackthorns. A crossbow bolt whistled past her ear and buried itself in a trunk with a sickening thud. "Stop, Clara! You'll only make it worse!" They recognize her. Of course they did. In a village as small as Eldridge Hollow, everyone knew the quiet healer who lived alone at the edge of the fields, the one whose sister had been taken by the forest's monster. Now they would paint her as a traitor who consorted with darkness. Her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, scraping her palms raw on the ground. She pushed up, tasting blood where she'd bitten her lip. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. Hooves pounded. Another bolt hissed by, this one grazing her shoulder and leaving a hot line of fire. That's when the beast roared. The sound shook the trees themselves, a deep, primal fury that rolled through the forest like thunder. Clara felt it in her bones, a vibration that made her knees weak even as it sent a strange, fierce protectiveness surging through her chest. She risked a glance back. The massive black wolf exploded from the undergrowth like living shadow, chain clinking wildly. He slammed into the lead rider with bone-crushing force, sending horse and man crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs and screams. The other hunters wheeled their mounts, silver-tipped spears glinting in the moonlight. Crossbows sang. One arrow struck the beast's flank, another his shoulder. He didn't falter. He moved like vengeance given form, tearing through the small group with terrifying precision, scattering men and horses alike. But he wasn't fighting to kill. He was fighting to drive them back, to buy her time. She knew this was her opening to run, but she couldn't help watching in horror as another silver arrow found its mark, this one sinking deep into the beast's side just behind his foreleg. He staggered, a pained snarl ripping from his throat, but he still placed himself between her and the remaining hunters. Blood, dark and glistening, matted his beautiful silver-streaked fur. Something inside Clara snapped. Instead of fleeing, she ran towards the beast. "Get back!" she shouted at the hunters, voice raw. "Leave him alone!" The remaining men hesitated, eyes wide at the sight of the village healer rushing toward the monster they had come to slay. In that moment of confusion, the beast whirled, eyes meeting hers with something like desperate command. Go. But she was already there. Her hands found the arrow wound before she could think better of it. Warm blood coated her fingers as she pressed her palms to the ragged flesh. Heat flared, not the clean warmth of her usual healing, but something wilder, older. The air crackled. For one impossible second, the beast's golden eyes shimmered, and Clara saw him, a man's face overlaying the wolf's, strong jaw shadowed with stubble, golden eyes fierce with pain, and something deeper, a mouth shaped around a word she couldn't hear. Then the voice came, deep, rough, like gravel wrapped in velvet, echoing inside her mind rather than her ears. Stay. The single word wrapped around her heart like a chain far gentler than the iron one still dangling from his leg. It carried exhaustion, longing, and a quiet, aching plea that made tears prick at her eyes. The hunters recovered their nerve. Shouts rose again. Another bolt flew. The beast lunged once more, roaring with renewed fury despite the arrow buried in his side. The sound scattered the last of the men. Horses screamed and bolted. Within moments, the forest fell silent, except for the ragged sound of her own breathing and the beast's labored pants. Clara kept her hands on the wound, pouring every scrap of her energy into it. The bleeding slowed, but she could feel how deep the silver had bitten. His massive body trembled under her touch, yet he tried to remain still, letting her work. When she finally pulled back, her hands were shaking, coated in his blood. The spark faded, leaving only the echo of that rough voice in her mind. Stay. She looked up into his golden eyes, now clouded with pain. I can't, she whispered, voice breaking. They'll come back, more of them. You have to hide. He dipped his head once. Then, with what seemed like tremendous effort, he nudged her shoulder with his muzzle. Gentle, insistent. Go. Clara rose on unsteady legs. Her shoulder burned where the bolt had grazed her, but the pain felt distant. All she could feel was the echo of that single word and the terrifying certainty that something fundamental had shifted inside her tonight. She ran. This time she didn't look back. Branches whipped at her face. She burst from the tree line into the cold night air of the fields, chest heaving, cloak torn and stained with the beast's blood. Behind her, the forbidden forest swallowed its secrets once more. Clara made it to her small cottage, on the edge of Eldridge Hollow, just as the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon. She barred the door with trembling hands, stripped off her ruined cloak, and washed the blood from her skin in a basin of cold water. But no amount of scrubbing could erase the memory of the voice that had whispered stay directly into her soul. She collapsed onto her narrow bed fully clothed, heart still racing. Sleep came in fitful bursts, haunted by dreams of a man with golden eyes reaching for her through chains of black iron and living thorns. Far away, unseen by Clara as she finally drifted into uneasy rest, a tall figure stood on the battlements of Grimward Castle, overlooking the dark sprawl of the forbidden forest. His cold eyes narrowed against the rising sun, his hands gripping the stone parapet until the knuckles whitened. A scout had reported a woman moving with the beast, tending its wounds no less. A woman from the village. The man's thin lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. The next day, Clara moved with the same quiet competence she had always worn like armor, brewing fever tonics for old Widow Hale, stitching a gash on the miller's arm, listening with patient silence while mothers complained about thin rations and restless children. No one spoke of the night in the forest, at least not to her face, but she caught the sideways glances, the way conversations hushed when she passed the market stalls. Word traveled fast in a village this small. Someone had seen her cloak stained dark, or perhaps one of the hunters had let slip that she had been with the creature. Traitor. Beast lover. The accusations hung unspoken in the air like smoke. 3 more villagers had vanished in the past 2 weeks. Good people, taken without trace or struggle. The elders swore the beast was growing bolder, its hunger no longer contained by the trees. Fresh claw marks scarred the eastern pastures, and a scrap of cloak belonging to one of Mara's closest friends had been found at the tree line. Anyone who dared approach the forbidden forest now risked the same fate. She told herself she would not go back. The risk was too great. Silver arrows, accusations of treason, the growing suspicion in every villager's eyes. Yet every evening as the sun dipped behind the hills, that single rough word echoed in her mind like a heartbeat she could not silence. Stay. On the 3rd night, the pull became unbearable. Clara slipped from her cottage under a clouded sky, the new moon a thin sliver that barely lit her path. Her satchel held less meat than before, but she had added a small jar of her strongest healing salve. Her hands still remembered the heat of his blood, the way a spark had flared between her palms and his wound. The forest welcomed her differently now. The blackthorns seemed to part just enough, the moss muffling her steps as if deciding she belonged. She reached the lightning-split oak and set out the offering with steadier hands than she expected. Then she waited, heart thudding against her chest. He came sooner than before. The massive black wolf emerged from the shadows with that same liquid grace, golden eyes finding hers instantly. The arrow wound on his flank had closed to an angry red line. He limped only slightly as he approached the stone, but instead of eating, he lowered his great head and nudged the small jar of salve toward her with his muzzle. Clara's breath caught. For me? A soft huff answered. He settled onto his haunches, chain clinking softly, and watched her with patient intensity. She knelt a few paces away, close enough to see the rise and fall of his broad chest. You're healing well, she said, voice low and warm. But silver lingers. Let me look. He shifted closer without hesitation, offering his injured side. Clara's fingers trembled only slightly as she applied the salve, smoothing it over the puckered flesh. His fur was coarser than she expected, yet warm, and beneath it, she felt the powerful play of muscle. The old scars that crisscrossed his shoulders told stories of battles long past, deep gashes that had healed unevenly, as if whatever had made them had fought to leave its mark. You've carried a great deal of pain, she murmured, more to herself than him. I know something about that. As her hands worked, a faint thread of warmth brushed against her thoughts. Not words, but a feeling. Gratitude, mingled with something deeper, quieter. Protection. The sensation was so clear, so intimate, that she pulled back slightly, searching his golden eyes. Are you speaking to me? She asked softly. His ears flicked forward. The connection strengthened, and this time a single hoarse word formed in her mind, rough as if dragged from a throat unused to speech. Yes. Clara's pulse quickened, not with fear, but wonder. Over the following nights, she brought what little food she could spare, her own stomach often empty so his might be full. One night, she arrived exhausted after a long day tending a difficult birth. She set the meat down and sank onto the moss, back against the oak's rough bark. The miller's wife nearly didn't make it, she told him, voice heavy. Her husband kept begging me to save her. Sometimes I wonder if I'm only delaying the inevitable. The beast, Shadow, she had begun calling him in the quiet of her thoughts, moved closer than ever before. He circled once, then settled beside her, his massive body forming a living wall against the night's chill. His flank pressed lightly against her arm, warm and solid. When she leaned her head back and closed her eyes for just a moment, she felt the brush of his muzzle against her hair, gentle as a caress. Rest, his voice came, still hoarse but clearer now, threaded with quiet concern. She smiled despite herself. Shadow, she whispered, testing the name aloud for the first time. It slipped out soft and affectionate, carrying more longing than she intended. "You make it sound so simple." His golden eyes half-lidded in what might have been pleasure at the nickname. He stayed there while she dozed, a silent guardian, his breathing deep and steady. When she woke, the moon had shifted, and he had brought her a small cluster of star-bloom flowers, rare white petals that glowed faintly in the dark. She tucked one behind her ear without thinking, and the way his gaze lingered on her made her cheeks heat. Their conversations grew in fragments. He could not speak long sentences, but he answered her questions with images and feelings that painted themselves across her mind. She told him about Mara, how her sister had been the bright one, always laughing, always dragging Clara into adventures. Mara climbing the tallest oak in the village just to prove she could reach the sky. Mara sneaking honey cakes from the baker's window and leaving half for Clara with a wink. Mara promising they would see the world beyond the hollow, one day, hand in hand. "I keep wondering if she suffered," Clara admitted one night, fingers tracing an old scar along his shoulder. "If she was afraid at the end." Shadow made a low, pained sound in his chest. He nudged her hand with his nose, then carefully placed a smooth black stone into her palm. It was warm from his body heat. An image suddenly flickered through their bond. A woman with dark hair like Clara's, alive, frightened but unbroken, hidden somewhere beyond the trees. Clara's breath shattered. "Mara?" Her sister's name tore from her throat, raw and trembling. Her fingers clenched around the stone until the edges bit into her skin. She had mourned her sister, pictured her bones scattered in the forest, imagined her final terrified moments. Now this, a fragile thread of hope that felt almost cruel in its brightness. "You've seen her? She's still alive?" His response came murky, but the feeling was one of deep regret and a fierce, protective urgency. He could not give her more. Clara stared at the stone in her palm, heart pounding. Part of her wanted to believe it with every fiber of her being. Another part whispered that it was only a memory, the last thing Shadow had seen before Mara was taken. But the image refused to fade, and it only deepened the mystery of the creature before her. Who was he? And why did he carry such regret? The question tugged at her constantly. During one visit, she wandered a little deeper while he ate, drawn by faint carvings on a cluster of standing stones, half swallowed by moss and vines. Ancient runes twisted across the weathered surfaces, faint lines depicting a crowned figure on bended knee before an enormous, ancient tree. The tree's thick roots rose like living chains, curling around the silhouette of a great wolf. She traced the carving with trembling fingers. When she returned to the oak, Shadow was waiting, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. He pressed close, humming with longing. Under the faint moonlight, Clara reached up slowly, her palm resting against the side of his massive neck. His fur was warm, his pulse strong beneath her touch. "You feel like more than a beast," she said quietly. "Did you choose this? To be trapped here?" His golden eyes darkened, something raw flickering across them. For a heartbeat, the air grew heavy around them. Then a partial shift rippled through him. His muzzle shortened into a strong, shadowed jaw. Broad shoulders took on a more human shape beneath the thick fur. Clawed fingers replaced heavy paws as his form hovered between wolf and man. "Clara." Her name fell from his lips in a low, hoarse rasp, no longer only in her mind but spoken aloud. It sent a shiver racing down her spine. "Danger. Grows." He lifted one clawed hand, slow and careful, cupping the side of her face. The touch was surprisingly gentle, the pads of his fingers warm against her skin. Their breaths mingled in the cool, night air. His golden eyes, still sharp with wolf instincts but filled with deeply human yearning, held hers without flinching. Clara's heart hammered wildly. This close, she could see the man trapped inside the beast, the strong line of his jaw, the way his lips had begun to form. The restrained power radiating from him no longer frightened her. It drew her in. She tilted her face up, pulse racing. Tell me I'm not imagining this. His head lowered slowly. Their lips were a breath apart, the promise of a kiss hanging like charged lightning. Shouts shattered the stillness. Torches flared brighter and closer than before, cutting through the trees like blades of fire. This time the hunters moved with grim discipline. No panicked villagers, but Grimward's elite silver guard, their armor glinting coldly, crossbows already raised and loaded with barbed silver bolts. Their boots struck the ground in tight formation, voices low and efficient. Shadow's partial form tensed, his shift reversed with brutal suddenness, bones cracking as fur surged back. Pain flashed across his golden eyes. For one fleeting moment he pressed closer, his warm tongue brushing a single gentle lick across her cheek before he gave a soft, broken whimper that tore straight through her heart. Then he shoved her away with careful force. Clara stumbled back, chest tight with sudden terror. "Shadow!" He roared, the sound raw and defiant, and lunged toward the advancing torches, deliberately drawing every eye and every weapon away from her. Arrows whistled through the dark. A moment later, a deep, agonized howl ripped through the forest, followed by another and another, each one more distant as he led the hunters deeper into the blackthorns. Clara ran. Tears blurred her vision. Branches whipped across her face and tore at her cloak, but the forest seemed to aid her escape, roots shifting just enough to snag pursuing boots while guiding her own frantic steps. Still, every stride away from him carved a deeper hollow in her chest. She didn't see the arrows strike. She only heard his howls, pain-laced, furious, and growing fainter, each one a knife twisting in her ribs. By the time she burst from the tree line into the cold night air of the fields, gasping and shaking, the truth crashed over her with devastating force. She was falling in love with him, for the man trapped inside this lonely beast, a man she might never hold in her arms. And somewhere in the shadows behind her, the hunters closed in once more, their silver blades hungry for the heart of the beast. Clara pressed a hand to her racing chest and whispered into the darkness, her voice breaking. "Come back to me, Shadow." Sleep came in uneasy waves that night, pulling her under only to spit her back out again. In the dreams, she walked through moonlit ruins, the same standing stones she had found in the forest, but older, whole. A man knelt before the great tree, tall, broad-shouldered, golden eyes burning with resolve, crown on his brow, hands outstretched. The tree's roots rose like living chains, wrapping around him, sinking into his skin, binding man to beast. "I accept," the man said, "my freedom for their safety. Let the forest become the wall they cannot breach." The roots tightened. Pain flared across his features as fur rippled over skin, bones reshaping, until the wolf stood where the king had been. Golden eyes met hers across the dreamscape, filled with centuries of loneliness. Clara woke gasping, heart pounding so hard her ribs ached. Was that Shadow? The next morning she slipped away at first light, terrified he was gone. She moved along the forest's edge, then deeper when no patrols appeared, calling his name softly. Nothing answered. She searched the lightning-split oak, the standing stones, the small clearing where they had nearly kissed. Only broken branches and dark stains on the moss remained. Blood, some of it his. Her knees buckled. She pressed a hand to the ground where the largest stain had soaked in. Shadow. If he had died protecting her, if the last thing he ever felt was pain because she had been too stubborn to stay away. A sob caught in her throat. She had finally found someone who saw her, who listened without judgment, who made the hollow places inside her feel a little less vast. And now he might be gone. That afternoon, the village square filled with grim-faced people. Lord General Caelor Grimward stood on the raised platform, voice carrying like cold iron. 3 good men died last night in the forest, brave hunters who answered the call to protect us. The beast is still at large, bolder than ever. It has taken 5 more of our own these past weeks. It took young Mara Fenn, dragging her screaming into the blackthorns while her sister waited helplessly at home. We will not suffer this abomination any longer. At the solstice we ride with silver and fire. The monster will fall, and Eldridge, Hollow will be safe again. Clara stood at the back, hood low. Relief crashed over her so hard her legs nearly gave way. 3 men had died, Grimward's elite hunters. Shadow was still alive, but something in Grimward's words chilled her. The way he spoke of Mara, dragging her screaming into the blackthorns. How could he know she had screamed? No one had witnessed it. No one had ever found her body. Suspicion bloomed cold and sharp in her chest. Why was Grimward so eager to paint the beast as the villain of every tragedy? She took a longer, less used path into the forest that evening to avoid the doubled patrols. Her steps were cautious, heart still raw from the morning's fear. Halfway to the oak, she nearly tripped over a weathered satchel half hidden in the ferns. Inside were Mara's favorite silver hairpins, the ones she had worn the night she vanished, and a small scrap of fabric torn from the dress Clara had sewn for her sister's 20th birthday. The edges of the tear were clean, deliberate, not claw marks. Old blood stained one corner. Clara's breath caught. Mara hadn't been taken by any beast. She was being held by someone who wanted the world to believe the forest monster was responsible. Before she could process the discovery, shouts rang out behind her. There, near the tree line, the healer! Hunters, Grimward's silver guard, had spotted her. Boots pounded against the earth like war drums. Crossbows sang, bolts slicing the air with deadly whistles. Clara ran. She darted deeper into the trees, heart slamming against her ribs, legs burning with every desperate stride. A bolt hissed past her ear, burying itself in a trunk with a sickening thunk. Another grazed her thigh, leaving a hot, searing line of fire that made her stumble. Pain flared bright and sharp, but she pushed on, lungs screaming for air. The blackthorns reached for her like welcoming arms, yet the hunters were too close. Their heavy breaths, the clank of armor, the metallic scent of silver cutting through the pine. Just then, a roar shattered the forest. The sound rolled through the trees like thunder, deep and primal, vibrating in her bones. Clara's head snapped toward it, relief crashing over her so violently her vision blurred. Shadow exploded from the shadows like living night, massive and furious, silver-streaked fur rippling with lethal grace. He slammed into the nearest hunter with bone-crushing force, sending man and horse crashing sideways into the underbrush. Before the others could react, he wheeled with terrifying speed, golden eyes blazing with protective rage. Arrows flew. One struck his shoulder with a meaty thud. Another grazed his ribs. He didn't falter. Instead, he charged again, a whirlwind of teeth and fury, deliberately positioning his massive body between Clara and the hunters. His roars shook the canopy, a deafening challenge that said, "Come for me instead." He lunged at the next man, jaws snapping inches from a silver blade, forcing the hunter to drop his crossbow and scramble backward. With a powerful sweep of his head, he knocked 2 more off their feet, scattering them like broken twigs. Every move was calculated, driving them back, drawing every weapon, every shout, every barbed silver bolt away from her. "Shadow!" Clara cried, voice raw with terror. He turned his head just long enough for their eyes to meet, golden, fierce and filled with unwavering devotion, before he lunged once more. This time a silver bolt buried deep in his flank with a sickening sound. He staggered, a pained snarl ripping from his throat, but he kept fighting, refusing to yield ground. Clara's heart twisted. She wanted to run to him, to pull the arrows from his flesh with her own hands, but she knew he was only fighting for her escape. Tears stung her eyes. Finally, with the remaining hunters scattered, he limped back to her, blood streaming from multiple wounds, matting his beautiful silver-streaked coat. His breathing came in labored, ragged pants, each one a knife in her chest. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, hands shaking as she tore strips from her cloak. She pressed her palms directly over the worst wounds, one on his shoulder, another deep in his flank, trying to stem the flow of blood while pouring every ounce of her healing gift into him. The spark flared again, wild and ancient, but the silver fought back viciously, burning against her touch like liquid fire. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks as she leaned over him, one hand cradling the side of his massive neck, while the other stayed pressed firmly to the deepest gash. "Why do you keep saving me?" His golden eyes found hers, pain clouding their brightness. Through the weakening bond came a rough, exhausted voice, hoarse, tender. "Because you are the first light I have known in years. Seeing you safe is worth every wound." Clara leaned her forehead against his, fingers buried in the thick fur of his neck, feeling the alarmingly rapid beat of his heart. "I'm falling in love with you," she confessed, voice breaking. "With the man I see inside the wolf. I don't know how to stop." A soft, pained sound rumbled in his chest. He nuzzled her cheek with what little strength he had left. "Stay away," he sent, the words laced with sorrow so deep it stole her breath. "Live, Clara. Let the forest keep me. You deserve sunlight, not chains." "No," she said fiercely, even as fresh tears fell. "I won't leave you here alone. I'll find a way to free you. I swear it." His eyes drifted half-closed, exhaustion pulling at him, but the bond carried one last fragile thought. "My brave healer. You already have." As night deepened, Clara sat vigil beside the wounded wolf, heart torn between terror and fierce determination. The solstice hunt was coming. Grimward's lies were closing in, and somewhere in the shadows, her sister was still alive. She refused to lose either of them. Hours later, Shadow's breathing had steadied, but every inhale carried a faint hitch that made her chest tighten. She leaned closer, forehead resting against the thick fur between his ears. "You're still here," she whispered, voice raw from earlier tears. Shadow's golden eyes opened a fraction. The pain in them had dulled to a weary glow. He shifted with obvious effort, pressing the side of his muzzle more firmly against her shoulder in a gesture that felt like both thanks and apology. Through the bond, his voice came faint but steady. "You should not have come back." "I couldn't stay away," she answered softly. Her free hand stroked slowly along the uninjured line of his neck, feeling the powerful muscles twitch under her touch. "Not when I thought I might have lost you." They stayed like that for a long time, her kneeling in the moss, him lying half-curled around her, offering what little warmth his battered body could give. The night air grew cooler, but the space between them remained warm. Occasionally his tongue would brush her wrist in a gentle, shy caress, as if reminding her he was still fighting. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the canopy, Clara finally pulled back enough to look at him fully. The silver burns around the arrow wounds were angry and inflamed, but the bleeding had stopped. She tore fresh strips from what remained of her cloak and rebound them with steady hands, murmuring the old healing words her grandmother had taught her. Each time her palms settled over his injuries, the bond hummed faintly, carrying fragments of memory that were not her own. a moonlit coronation, banners snapping in the wind, the great hall filled with nervous nobles, while border reports grew darker each day. A young king, broad-shouldered, golden-eyed, crowned but already weary, slipped away from the feast and walked alone into the ancient heart of the forest. There, beneath the oldest tree, he knelt and offered everything he was. Clara's breath caught as the memory flooded her. She remembered that year clearly, the rumors of invasion, the way Eldridge Hollow had braced for war that never came. She had been 22, still grieving her parents, learning her grandmother's craft by candlelight. She had heard whispers of the king's sudden disappearance. No one knew the truth. "It was you," she whispered, fingers tracing the edge of one jagged scar on his shoulder. 5 years ago. You chose this. You gave up yourself so the living barrier would rise and keep the invaders out, while the rest of us slept safely behind your sacrifice. You were here, alone. Shadow's ears flicked. A wave of sorrow and quiet acceptance rolled through the bond, wordless but vivid. More images followed, burning border villages, starving families huddled behind crumbling walls, the desperate weight of a crown that could no longer protect its people through steel alone. Then the tree, the high roots rising like living chains, the searing pain as man and beast merged into one eternal guardian. Clara's throat tightened. The howls I heard, they started not long after you disappeared. I thought they were the cries of a monster. Her voice thickened with emotion. You were slowly losing yourself here, protecting everyone while no one protected you. He nuzzled her palm, warm breath ghosting across her skin. Worth it, he sent, the thought laced with deep exhaustion. Until you. The intimacy of the moment wrapped around her like the warmth of his body. She rested her cheek against his neck again, listening to the steady thump of his heart beneath her ear. Later, when his breathing had deepened into something closer to true rest, the bond opened further, hesitant at first, then wider, like a door creaking on rusted hinges. He showed her fragments of Mara's final night, a young woman with dark hair much like Clara's, running through the blackthorns, terrified but determined, clutching something small and silver in her fist. Shadow racing to reach her, only to be driven back by flashing silver nets and the harsh flare of torches. Men dragging the woman away while shouting loud enough for the whole forest to hear. The beast has taken her. Clara's fingers tightened in Shadow's fur. She didn't speak at first. She simply breathed through the ache of that final night, how she had waited by the window, heart in her throat, praying Mara would come bursting through the door with another wild story. Shadow nuzzled closer, resting his great head against her thigh. He sent another careful fragment, the glint of silver hairpins catching torchlight as Mara was pulled toward a wagon in chains. The wagon bore a faint crest, Grimward's. Clara's breath fractured. A wave of dread slammed into her, followed instantly by white-hot fury. Her sister, bright, fearless Mara, had been dragged away by Grimward's own men while they screamed that the beast had taken her. They had framed Shadow for everything. They stole her, she whispered, voice shaking with rage. Why? What could possibly be worth all these lies? Shadow made a low, pained sound in his chest, his eyes dark with shared regret. He pressed closer, offering what comfort he could, warmth, steadiness, the promise that she was not alone. They spent the next nights carefully retracing what they could. Shadow would lead her to places his memory still reached. A broken branch here, a scrap of fabric caught on thorns there. Each small discovery was pieced together slowly, like stitching a wound. Clara's mind turned the pieces over and over, turning them in the light of everything she knew about the village, the patrols, and Grimward's growing grip on power. One evening, as they sheltered beneath the lightning-split oak, the realization settled over her. She sat up slowly, still leaning against his warm flank, her hand idly stroking the fur along his chest. "The wagon," she murmured, voice tight. "If it belonged to Grimward's men, supply wagons always head north after raids, toward the old hunting lodge the patrols use as a camp. That's where they store the silver nets and extra weapons. That's where they would have taken her." Shadow made a low sound of agreement. His golden eyes watched her with open fondness. He shifted, curling more protectively around her smaller frame, then leaned in and gave her temple a slow, gentle lick, full of the affection he no longer tried to hide. Clara's breath caught at the tender gesture. She turned, pressing her forehead against the side of his neck. "We're doing this together," she said softly. "You and I. No more carrying everything alone." From that night onward, they moved north. Each evening, they slipped deeper into the forest, following the faint trail of memory. Shadow led when his strength allowed, limping but determined, while Clara kept watch for patrols. Food had grown dangerously scarce. She had not dared return to the village, and her own rations had long since run out. Shadow noticed. Despite the silver still burning in his wounds, he began slipping away during the quiet hours to hunt. He returned each time with small game laid carefully at her feet like offerings. They shared the meat roasted over the smallest of fires she dared light. He would watch her eat first, eyes soft with quiet satisfaction, before taking his own portion. One night, after he had brought back a plump hare, Clara tore the cooked meat into pieces and held the first portion to his muzzle. "You're still healing. Let me take care of you too." He accepted the offering with gentle care, his tongue brushing her fingers in quiet thanks. Then he settled beside her, pressing his massive body against her side, as if he could shield her from the entire world. His muzzle rested on her shoulder, warm breath stirring her hair. They were still uncertain exactly where Mara was being held, but every mile north brought them a little closer to the truth, and to each other. Little did they know, far beyond the blackthorns, Grimward's preparations had grown feverish. In the torchlit halls of his keep, he paced before a map pinned with red markers, jaw tight with impatience. The solstice was still 2 nights away, but rumors were spreading too fast. The healer had been seen near the forest again. If she reached the lodge and found the girl, if the villagers began to question his carefully crafted story, no, he could not wait. The barrier had to fall now, before anyone connected the disappearances to his growing coffers and the Empire's gold. He would launch the hunt at dusk. Silver and fire would end the beast tonight, and with it, any loose threads that threatened his throne. Grimward launched the hunt at dusk, 2 nights before the appointed time. Clara felt the shift the moment the first flames appeared on the horizon, a distant orange glow that turned the trees into jagged silhouettes. She was already deep in the forest, heading north with Shadow limping steadfastly at her side when the horns sounded behind them. Grimward's forces were closing in faster than expected. Torches blazed through the blackthorns like a river of fire. Silver nets glinted in the leaping light. Hooves thundered. Shouts rang out, sharp, coordinated, merciless. Grimward himself rode at the head on a black stallion, cold eyes cutting through the darkness like blades. Fear slammed into Clara's chest, sharp and metallic. They weren't going to make it. "Run!" she gasped, grabbing fistfuls of Shadow's fur as she tried to urge him forward. Her legs burned, breath coming in ragged bursts. Shadow stayed glued to her side, his massive body shielding her as best despite the silver still burning in his wounds. The hunters gained ground. A silver bolt whistled past her ear and buried itself in a tree with a terrifying thunk. Another grazed Shadow's haunch. He snarled but kept moving, positioning himself between her and the oncoming tide of flame and steel. Clara's heart hammered with raw terror. "We stay together. Do you hear me? Together." Shadow's golden eyes met hers for one desperate heartbeat, filled with fear for her, before he pressed even closer, his warm flank brushing her side as they ran. But the hunters were too many, too well armed. Torches ringed the ancient heart just as they reached the clearing. Silver nets glinted in the firelight. Grimward sat astride his stallion at the center, cold eyes scanning the darkness with triumphant hunger. Clara stumbled to a halt, chest heaving, and stepped forward before Shadow could stop her. She placed herself squarely between the hunters and the wounded wolf, hands trembling but voice ringing clear and steady through the chaos. "Enough!" Grimward's gaze snapped to her. A thin smile curved his lips. "The healer, still consorting with the abomination I see. Step aside. This ends tonight." "No," Clara said, lifting her chin. Her heart hammered, but the bond thrummed with Shadow's quiet strength behind her. "This beast, the king, has protected this kingdom for 5 years while you sold its safety for profit. You staged the attacks. You took my sister. You framed him for every disappearance so you could tear down the barrier and sell passage to the Empire." A ripple of uneasy murmurs moved through the hunters. Grimward's thin smile never wavered. He looked down at her from his stallion with the contempt of a man addressing a misbehaving child. "The village healer speaks of kings and conspiracies," he drawled, voice dripping with mockery. "Did the beast whisper these fairy tales in your ear while you warmed his fur at night?" He gestured with one gloved hand. "Take them both, the girl first. Let the monster watch." The hunters surged forward. Rough hands seized Clara's arms, yanking her away from Shadow. One man backhanded her hard across the face. The blow snapped her head to the side and sent blood blooming across her lip. Another kicked her legs out from under her, sending her sprawling into the dirt. Pain exploded across her cheek and ribs. Shadow's roar split the night, raw, furious. He lunged, massive body slamming into the nearest hunter with bone-crushing force, trying desperately to reach her. But more men closed in, silver nets flashing in the torchlight. They beat at him with spear shafts and weighted clubs, driving him back while others pinned Clara down. "Shadow," she cried, struggling against the hands holding her. Tears stung her eyes, not from the pain, but from the sight of him bleeding again. She wrenched one arm free and threw herself forward, wrapping both arms around his thick neck in a fierce, desperate hug. Her face pressed into the blood-matted fur between his ears as she clung to him with everything she had. "I won't let them take you. From me," she sobbed against him. "Not like this. Not ever. I love you. Do you hear me? I love you." The bond ignited. Everything they had shared crashed through them at once. The first night she offered him meat with trembling hands, the gentle brush of his muzzle against her hair, the starbloom flowers he brought her, the terror of hearing his howls fade into the distance while she ran. Clara poured every scrap of her healing gift, every ounce of her love and fierce refusal to let him carry the burden alone, straight into the heart of that connection. The stones around them answered with a blinding golden light that seared through the clearing. The ground trembled. Ancient roots erupted from the earth in writhing coils, glowing with the same radiant power. The air itself thickened, charged and humming, pressing against skin and bone until it felt as though the forest was breathing with them. Shadow's massive form shuddered beneath her arms and began to shift. It was slow, agonizing, and breathtaking. Fur receded in rippling waves, bones realigned with audible cracks that made the hunters recoil in horror. The massive wolf rose, reshaping into a tall, battle-scarred man. He wore the torn remnants of fine dark leathers from 5 years ago, the royal tunic ripped at the shoulders, the cloak hanging in tatters, but the fabric did nothing to hide the powerful lines of his body. Broad shoulders, corded arms marked by old scars, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and golden eyes that burned even through the pain. Despite the fresh wounds and silver burns, he was regal, every inch the king he had once been. Connor Vielle stood before her, breathing hard. For one heartbeat, he simply looked at her. Then he cupped her face with one calloused hand, thumb gently brushing the blood from her split lip. "Clara," he said, voice rough, "stay behind me." Grimward's face twisted with contempt. He looked down at Clara with disdain. "Turns out the village healer is a witch protecting her pet monster." Connor's golden eyes blazed with fury. "Where is she, Grimward?" he demanded, voice low and lethal. "What did you do with Mara Fenn? What have you done with all the others?" Grimward laughed, a cold, condescending sound. "Listen to yourself. 5 years as a mindless animal, and you've lost all common sense. The girl has clearly bewitched you with her forest sorcery." He gestured sharply to his men. "Take them both." The hunters surged forward. Connor met them head-on, roaring with raw, protective rage. He slammed into the first man, disarming him with brutal efficiency, every strike calculated to keep the blades away from Clara. In the chaos, Clara twisted free for a precious second. Her eyes darted past the ring of torches and landed on the supply wagons at the edge of the clearing. Heart pounding, she pointed desperately. "The wagons!" she shouted over the clash of steel. "Mara, she's in the wagons." Connor met her eyes for one fierce second. "Go!" he commanded, voice low and urgent, even as he blocked another blow. "Find her. I'll hold them." Clara broke free and ran toward the supply wagons at the edge of the clearing, legs burning, blood dripping from her split lip. Behind her, the clash of steel and Connor's roar filled the night as he held off Grimward's men. She tore open the first canvas flap, crates of silver-tipped arrows and coiled nets. The second wagon held barrels of oil and spare torches. Her heart slammed harder. The third, food stores and extra cloaks. Panic clawed at her throat. She ripped aside the final canvas. Chained inside, battered but alive, were Mara and half a dozen other missing villagers. Mara's dark hair was matted and dull, her once bright eyes sunken with exhaustion and fear, but they widened the instant they locked on Clara. "Clara?" Mara's voice cracked, as if she didn't dare believe what she was seeing. A sob tore from Clara's throat. She lunged forward, fingers already working frantically at the rough iron chains binding her sister's wrists. The metal was cold and biting. Mara's skin beneath it was raw and bruised. When the first cuff fell away, Clara pulled her sister into a crushing hug. Mara smelled of sweat, dirt, and fear, but underneath it was still her. The faint trace of the lavender soap they used to share. The warmth of the girl who once dragged Clara up trees and promised they'd see the world together. Clara buried her face in Mara's tangled hair, tears streaming freely now. "I thought you were dead," Clara choked out, voice breaking. "Every single day I thought you were gone." Mara clung to her just as fiercely, thin arms wrapping around Clara's waist. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, voice hoarse from disuse. "I kept telling myself, my stubborn sister would never stop looking." They held each other for one precious, shattering heartbeat before Clara pulled back just enough to start freeing the others with trembling hands. The freed prisoners stumbled out of the wagon, voices rising in outrage and disbelief as they saw the battle raging in the clearing. Clara grabbed Mara's hand. "Come on, we have to show them." They raced back just as Connor disarmed Grimward with a brutal strike, sending the Lord General staggering backward. "Look!" Clara shouted, voice carrying over the chaos, raw with fury and relief. She pulled Mara forward so the entire clearing could see her. chains still dangling from her wrists, face gaunt but unmistakable. These are the people he claimed the beast took. My sister, your neighbors, your kin. He staged every attack to tear down the barrier and sell us to the Empire. The hunters froze. Eyes widened in shock. Weapons slowly lowered. Mara stepped forward. His men dragged me away that night. They beat anyone who asked questions. It was Grimward whispers, turned to shouts of betrayal. The hunters' faces hardened with fury as the truth crashed over them like a wave. Grimward snarled, raising his silver blade one last time. "You fools! She's a witch!" Connor moved like lightning. He closed the distance, slamming his fist into Grimward's jaw with enough force to send the man crashing to the ground. "You sold my people's safety for gold. You took everything from me. You will answer for it." Grimward spat a mouthful of blood onto the dirt and laughed, a wet, hateful sound. Even on his knees, he glared up at Clara with pure contempt. "You think you've won, witch?" he snarled, teeth stained red. "You and your monster pet? I should have had you burned the first time you crawled into that forest. You're nothing but a filthy—" The standing stones flared with blinding golden light. Roots erupted from the earth like living serpents, thick and glowing with ancient power. They wrapped around Grimward's limbs with crushing force, thorns biting deep into flesh. He screamed as the roots tightened, dragging him upright and then slamming him to his knees before the ancient tree. Blood welled from the punctures, soaking his fine tunic. The barrier magic, strengthened by Clara's healing and Connor's restored will, rebounded against the man who had tried to destroy it. Torches sputtered and died in sudden gusts of wind. Silver weapons grew impossibly heavy in trembling hands, then clattered to the ground. Grimward thrashed, still spitting venom even as the roots coiled higher around his throat. "You'll all rot for this," he choked out, eyes bulging with rage and terror. "Especially you, healer. You and that beast." The roots constricted one final time. A sickening crunch cut his words short. His body jerked once, then went limp, suspended like a broken puppet before the ancient tree that had once been offered a king's sacrifice. Silence swept over the clearing, broken only by the crackle of dying embers and the ragged breathing of the survivors. Connor turned to Clara, battle-worn, human. For a heartbeat, he simply stared at her, eyes wide with wonder, as if he still couldn't believe he had arms to reach with. Then a rough, joyful sound escaped him, and he stepped forward, scooping her up in one fluid motion. Clara gasped as her feet left the ground. He swung her in a circle, his movements a little unsteady, like a man still remembering how his own body worked after 5 years as a wolf. His strong arms held her close, one hand splayed protectively across her back, the other cradling the back of her head as he buried his face in her hair. "Clara," he breathed, voice rough and warm against her ear. "My brave healer, you freed me." She laughed through fresh tears, arms wrapping tightly around his neck as she clung to him. He smelled of pine and the wild forest, unmistakably him. When he finally set her down, he didn't let go, keeping her tucked against his chest as if he might never release her again. "We did it together," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. Mara reached them then, throwing her arms around both of them in a slightly wobbly hug. "Wow," Mara said with a watery laugh, voice hoarse but sparkling with her old mischief. "I've been stuck in a wagon listening to Grimward's terrible monologues for months, and the first thing I see when I get out is my sister making hard eyes at the king. Get a room, you two." Clara let out a choked laugh and pulled her sister closer, the three of them tangled together in the glowing heart of the forest. Connor adjusted to his human body with quiet determination and occasional frustration. The first morning he tried to walk without limping, He nearly tripped over his own feet. He caught himself on a low branch, then laughed, a deep, rusty sound that made Clara's heart flip. He kept reaching for her, as if touch was the only way to convince himself the nightmare was truly over. One golden afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the forest canopy in warm shafts, Connor caught her hand and pulled her close beneath the lightning-split oak, the same tree where their story had begun. He moved slowly, still rediscovering the precise control of human fingers. One calloused palm cupped her cheek, thumb tracing the faint bruise that lingered from the final battle. His golden eyes searched hers with the same quiet intensity that had once watched her from the shadows. "Clara," he murmured. Before she could answer, he leaned down and kissed her. It was their first real kiss, not the stolen breath that fear had interrupted, but a slow, deliberate meeting of lips that tasted of pine, relief, aching longing finally given form. He kissed her like a man who had forgotten how to breathe and was only now remembering the taste of air. His mouth moved against hers with hunger, deepening gradually as if he wanted to memorize every sigh, every flutter of her pulse beneath his touch. His free arm slid around her waist, drawing her flush against the solid warmth of his body. She felt the steady thunder of his heart against her own, the faint tremor in his muscles as he relearned how to hold someone with hands instead of paws. When he finally pulled back, his breath came unsteady, warm against her lips. "I have wanted to do that," he said softly, "since the night you first called me Shadow." Clara laughed, a little breathless, fingers curling into the front of the simple tunic he now wore. "You were always following me, my silent shadow in the dark." He smiled. "And you fed that shadow when no one else would. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never go hungry again." True to his word, he began courting her properly. Each morning he disappeared briefly into the forest and returned with fresh game or berries, insisting on preparing meals himself. He watched her eat with the same quiet satisfaction he'd shown as a wolf, but now every bite she took healed something in him too. In the weeks that followed, they made their way back to Eldridge Hollow and then onward to the capital, where the kingdom slowly learned the truth of its lost king. Mara settled into her new role with characteristic energy. She had been given charge of the royal stables and the training of young messengers, a position that let her ride freely and tell anyone who would listen exactly what she thought of tyrants who locked people in wagons. She teased Connor mercilessly about his wolfish table manners and told Clara daily that she had excellent taste in kings. One crisp autumn evening, as the leaves turned gold and amber, Connor found Clara in the palace gardens. He pulled her gently into his arms, swaying with her under the fading light. Clara rested her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Then she asked softly, "Do you have any regrets about the sacrifice you made?" Connor was silent for a long breath. His hand stroked slow, soothing circles along her back as he gathered his thoughts. "I made it because I saw no other way. The Empire was at our borders. The old magic offered a bargain. One life bound to the forest in exchange for an unbreakable barrier. I was the king. It was my duty." He paused. "I never regretted my choice. Not until I heard a woman whispering comfort to a lonely beast in the dark. Then I regretted every day I could not hold her like this." Clara tilted her face up, eyes shining. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Connor leaned down and breathed her in. His nose brushed the curve of her temple, then slid slowly along her cheekbone as he drew a long, unsteady inhale, taking in the scent of her skin, the faint trace of herbs that always clung to her, the warmth that was uniquely Clara. A low, contented sound rumbled in his chest, the same soft sigh he used to make as a wolf when she rested against him in the dark. Then he dropped to one knee with surprising grace for a man still relearning his own limbs. Clara Fenn, you fed a shadow when no one else would. You taught a wolf how to be a man again. Will you stay with me? Not as my healer, not as my savior, as my queen, as the woman I want to wake beside every morning for the rest of our lives. Clara's eyes shone with tears. She sank to her knees in front of him, cupping his face with both hands. Yes, she whispered. I've been yours since the first time you accepted my offering, Shadow. He laughed softly, the sound warm and full of promise, and kissed her beneath the turning leaves. The howls that had once haunted the blackthorns were gone. In their place was the steady rhythm of two hearts that had finally found their way home, outlasting even the darkest forest. Where are you listening from? I love hearing your thoughts, and if you'd like to support me, please subscribe. It's free, and it helps more people find these stories.